She barely had time to fasten her seatbelt before the laughter reached her row. It wasn't loud enough to alert the flight attendants, but it carried the unmistakable edge of people who believed cruelty became acceptable when spoken with polished smiles. A man in an expensive tailored suit leaned toward his companions, glanced at the woman settling into the window seat, and muttered that first class must be offering charity upgrades now. The others chuckled, their eyes lingering on the faded canvas bag tucked carefully beneath her feet, the practical walking shoes beneath neatly pressed navy slacks, and the simple gray cardigan draped over her shoulders instead of the designer labels worn throughout the cabin. The woman neither defended herself nor acknowledged the remarks. She simply adjusted the worn leather watch on her wrist, folded her boarding pass with practiced precision, and rested one gentle hand atop the old canvas bag as though protecting something far more valuable than luggage. Her name was Evelyn Harper, and after 16 consecutive hours inside a trauma ward, silence felt more comforting than dignity defended before strangers. The faint scent of antiseptic still clung to her hands despite repeated washing, while the deep shadows beneath her eyes revealed the exhaustion of someone who measured time not by clocks but by heartbeats saved and families comforted. Across the aisle, a sharply dressed businesswoman whispered that the airline must have made a terrible mistake. Another passenger laughed softly and remarked that perhaps someone had confused first class with volunteer seating. Evelyn heard every word. Years in emergency medicine had trained her to hear the smallest sounds, the trembling breath before panic, the whispered goodbye beside hospital beds, the silence that often meant someone had stopped breathing altogether. Compared to those sounds, ridicule barely registered. She looked through the oval window where rain traced uneven paths across the glass, each droplet merging with another before disappearing into the rushing wind. Airports always reminded her how easily strangers crossed paths without ever truly seeing one another. A young flight attendant approached with a warm smile, offering champagne before departure. Evelyn politely declined and instead asked whether there was a physician or nurse traveling in economy should an emergency arise during the flight. The attendant blinked with mild surprise before answering that none had identified themselves yet. Evelyn nodded, quietly satisfied, then thanked her with genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with the impatient snapping fingers coming from nearby passengers demanding premium drinks. As the boarding process continued, conversations filled the cabin. Stocks, real estate, luxury vacations, and exclusive clubs floated through the air with effortless confidence. Evelyn remained absorbed in a weathered notebook she removed from her bag. Between its pages rested handwritten letters from patients' families, pressed flowers, and small drawings created by children whose lives she had helped save. She never carried photographs of awards because she had never accepted any. Gratitude written in shaky handwriting had always felt heavier than plaques displayed on hospital walls. While reaching for the notebook, her cardigan sleeve slipped slightly upward, exposing part of an old tattoo near her wrist. It had faded over time, the ink softened by years of scrubbing surgical disinfectant from her skin. It was small enough that most people overlooked it, a simple emblem enclosed within a circle accompanied by tiny numbers that had nearly disappeared beneath age. She noticed the exposed ink immediately and tugged her sleeve back into place without expression, almost instinctively, as though hiding a memory rather than a mark. A child seated several rows behind began coughing uncontrollably. Before the parents could even call for assistance, Evelyn's attention shifted. Her eyes tracked the rhythm of the cough, the color of the boy's face, the movement of his chest. She remained seated only because the child recovered after sipping water, but the speed with which she assessed the situation revealed instincts that had become inseparable from who she was. No one nearby noticed except the flight attendant, who quietly filed away the observation. The cabin doors prepared to close when a final announcement requested passengers to remain seated for one last boarding guest. Moments later, polished black shoes appeared at the front of the aisle, followed by the unmistakable bearing of a senior military officer. Conversation softened almost immediately. The man carried himself without unnecessary display, his posture shaped by decades of discipline rather than pride. His silver hair contrasted with the crisp lines of civilian attire that could not fully conceal the habits of command. Crew members greeted him respectfully, recognizing him before most passengers did. He acknowledged them with brief nods before making his way through the cabin toward the final first-class seat. His expression remained composed, attentive, quietly observant. He noticed everything without appearing to look at anything for long. As he reached Evelyn's row, his eyes drifted across the passengers with routine courtesy. Then they stopped. His gaze settled on the narrow space where her sleeve had shifted once again while she adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. The faded tattoo became visible for only a heartbeat. Yet that single heartbeat changed everything. His entire body froze. The practiced calm disappeared from his face, replaced by disbelief so profound it seemed to steal the air from his lungs. His breathing slowed. His shoulders stiffened. For several long seconds he neither moved nor spoke. The nearby passengers exchanged puzzled glances, assuming the distinguished Marine commander had recognized the celebrity or perhaps noticed some security concern. Instead, he stared only at the faded ink on Evelyn Harper's wrist, his eyes reflecting memories buried beneath decades of service. The commander swallowed hard, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly before he whispered words so quietly that only the nearest flight attendant heard them. "Please tell me, could that really be her?" The attendant looked from the commander to the quiet nurse who still gazed peacefully out the rain-covered window, completely unaware that a forgotten mark hidden beneath her sleeve had just awakened a past someone had spent half a lifetime trying to find. The commander remained motionless for another heartbeat before taking a slow breath that seemed heavier than the years etched across his face. The flight attendant quietly stepped aside, expecting him to continue toward his assigned seat, but instead he turned to Evelyn with an expression no one in the cabin could understand. Every passenger who had watched him board expecting military confidence now witnessed something entirely different. He lowered his head, not dramatically, not for attention, but with the unmistakable respect reserved for someone whose place in another person's life could never be measured by rank alone. The nearby conversations faded one by one until only the muted hum of the aircraft filled the cabin. Even those who had mocked Evelyn moments earlier found themselves watching in uneasy silence. The commander spoke carefully, almost as though he feared the answer. He asked whether her name was Evelyn Harper. She looked up with mild surprise, studying the familiar posture that time had reshaped but had not erased. She answered softly that it was. His eyes glistened before he asked one more question, his voice barely above a whisper. Had she once served as a civilian trauma nurse attached to a temporary medical unit overseas nearly 25 years earlier? Evelyn held his gaze for several seconds. 1,000 forgotten mornings seemed to pass through her eyes before she finally nodded once. The commander closed his eyes. For an instant he looked less like the decorated Marine everyone recognized and more like a young lieutenant carrying memories too heavy for one lifetime. He extended his hand, but before she could take it, he withdrew it again and instead placed it respectfully over his heart. The gesture puzzled everyone watching. He quietly introduced himself as Marine Commander Daniel Mercer. Evelyn repeated his name beneath her breath, searching through distant memories. Then recognition reached her. She smiled gently, not because she remembered medals or titles, but because she remembered a frightened young officer sitting outside an overcrowded field hospital with blood on his uniform that did not belong to him. "You survived," she said simply. The words struck him harder than any salute ever could. Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Survived what? No one dared interrupt. Daniel took the seat beside her instead of his own, asking the nearby passenger if they would mind exchanging places for a few minutes. The man agreed immediately, sensing something far beyond ordinary conversation was unfolding. Daniel looked at the faded tattoo once more. It was not decorative. It had been the emergency identification mark assigned to volunteers working inside a temporary battlefield medical station after official records were destroyed during an attack. Only those who had served there would recognize it. Most people would mistake it for meaningless ink. To Daniel, it represented the longest night of his life. Evelyn glanced toward the window. She had not spoken about those months and decades. She never wanted to. She had left the conflict behind the day she returned home and dedicated herself to civilian emergency medicine. There had always been new patients needing care. New families needing hope. Looking backward had never saved anyone. Daniel quietly asked whether she ever wondered what became of the soldiers she treated. She smiled sadly and admitted that every nurse wonders. Every single one. Some faces fade. Others remain forever. She confessed that she still remembered the names of children she could not save, the mothers who waited beside hospital beds, and young Marines who apologized for bleeding on freshly cleaned floors as though they were inconveniencing the staff. A few passengers lowered their eyes. The earlier jokes about her appearance now echoed uncomfortably inside their own minds. Daniel leaned forward, his voice becoming steadier as memories surfaced. He described a night when explosions had destroyed communication lines and evacuation helicopters could no longer reach the medical station. Supplies ran dangerously low. The wounded kept arriving. Smoke covered everything. Chaos swallowed every plan they had prepared. In the middle of that nightmare, one nurse refused to leave. She moved from bed to bed with calm hands while everyone else measured survival in minutes. She treated enemies and allies without hesitation because bleeding looked the same regardless of uniform. Evelyn interrupted softly, reminding him that every medic there had done the same. Daniel shook his head. No, they hadn't. Not after the second explosion. Many had been ordered to evacuate. You stayed because dozens of wounded couldn't move. His voice stopped. For several long seconds he said nothing at all. The aircraft cabin became strangely still. Even the engines seemed distant beneath the weight of that silence. Evelyn looked down at her folded hands. Daniel struggled to continue. When he finally spoke again, emotion roughened every word. He admitted that he had spent years believing she had died that night because every official report listed several medical volunteers as missing. No forwarding records. No commendations. No interviews. Nothing. She had simply disappeared from military history. Evelyn answered with quiet simplicity. She had gone home. There were hospitals that needed nurses. There were children waiting for operations. There were elderly patients with no families to visit them. Life had kept moving, and so had she. Recognition had never crossed her mind. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he no longer attempted to hide. He explained that hundreds of Marines had searched for the unnamed nurse carrying that emergency tattoo because survivors remembered only fragments. Some recalled her voice. Others remembered her steady hands. One remembered that she sang softly while changing bandages to distract frightened teenagers. No one knew where she went afterward. The records had vanished with the field hospital. Evelyn smiled faintly. She admitted she had almost removed the tattoo years ago, but never found the time. Besides, it reminded her of people whose names deserved remembering far more than her own. The businessman who had mocked her first lowered his gaze toward the polished leather shoes he had once believed said everything about a person's worth. Around him, shame spread quietly from seat to seat. Yet Daniel had not reached the reason he had frozen. He inhaled deeply before revealing the truth he had carried across continents for more than 2 decades. He looked directly into Evelyn's eyes and said that among the soldiers she refused to abandon that night was one unconscious 19-year-old Marine whose heartbeat stopped twice before dawn. Every doctor believed he would never leave the battlefield alive. But she refused to stop fighting for him. That young Marine survived. He returned home. He built a life. He eventually rose through the ranks until the nation entrusted him with thousands of lives under his command. Daniel's voice cracked as he placed his hand over his chest once more. Then he whispered the words that transformed the entire cabin. That 19-year-old Marine was me. Daniel's confession settled over the cabin with a quiet weight that no one dared disturb. The engines continued their steady roar beyond the windows, yet inside first class the only sound was the slow breathing of strangers who had just watched a lifetime of assumptions collapse in a matter of seconds. Evelyn looked at the commander with gentle disbelief before a faint smile crossed her tired face. She searched his features, now marked by silver hair and decades of responsibility, until she found the frightened young Marine she had once known. Not in his face, but in his eyes. Those eyes had looked at her through fever, blood loss, and unbearable uncertainty on a night when survival had seemed impossible. She remembered him now. She remembered how young he had been, how he had apologized for delaying treatment for others, insisting that the men beside him should go first. Even while slipping in and out of consciousness, he had worried about strangers more than himself. Daniel smiled through tears and admitted that she had remembered his character more clearly than his face, and somehow that felt exactly right. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a weathered envelope whose edges had softened with age. It had traveled across military bases, oceans, and countless deployments. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed a faded photograph protected inside a transparent sleeve. The picture showed a temporary medical tent surrounded by dust and shattered equipment. Near the center stood a young nurse with rolled sleeves, exhaustion written across her face, her hands stained from treating patient after patient. She wasn't looking toward the camera. She was focused entirely on someone lying just outside the frame. Daniel explained that another Marine had taken the photograph minutes before the final evacuation. It was the only image anyone had ever found of the woman who had refused to abandon the wounded. Every investigation ended the same way. Records destroyed. Personnel scattered. Names missing. She had become less a person than a story whispered among Marines whenever courage was discussed. Some believed she had died. Others believed she had retired under another name. A few thought she had never existed at all, becoming little more than military folklore. Evelyn stared quietly at the photograph before letting out a soft laugh filled with humility rather than pride. She shook her head and remarked that she looked exhausted enough to sleep for a week. Several passengers smiled through their own tears. It was such an ordinary observation that it somehow made the extraordinary moment feel even more human. Daniel folded the photograph with careful hands before standing. He faced the entire cabin, not because he sought an audience, but because truth sometimes deserved witnesses. The laughter that had greeted Evelyn when she boarded now seemed impossibly distant. Every face followed him as he spoke. He explained that military decorations often recognized acts witnessed by commanding officers, documented in reports, and preserved in official records. But some of the greatest acts of courage disappeared into smoke, confusion, and forgotten paperwork. He said that history occasionally failed the very people who shaped it most. Then he turned toward Evelyn once more. In a voice steady with gratitude, he said that every Marine under his command owed something, however indirectly, to the woman sitting beside the window. Because she had refused to give up on one frightened young man, that young man had later led rescue missions, protected civilians, mentored future officers, and brought countless service members safely home to their families. One decision made in compassion had echoed through thousands of lives she would never meet. Evelyn lowered her eyes. She gently corrected him, saying she had not saved thousands. She had simply refused to stop trying to save one. The commander nodded slowly. That, he replied, was exactly how thousands were saved. A profound silence filled the cabin once more. No applause came at first. It felt too small for what everyone had just heard. The businessman who had mocked her earlier slowly rose from his seat. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by visible embarrassment. He stepped into the aisle and looked directly at Evelyn. There was no attempt to excuse his behavior, no explanation about a difficult day or misunderstood intentions. He simply admitted that he had judged her within seconds of seeing her, and had been completely wrong. One by one, the others who had laughed offered quiet apologies of their own. Evelyn accepted each with the same grace she had shown when enduring their ridicule. She neither celebrated their regret nor reminded them of their cruelty. She merely thanked them for their honesty. The flight attendant returned carrying the meal service but hesitated, sensing the moment deserved something different. Instead of asking who wished to be served first, she placed a handwritten note beside Evelyn's seat. It read only, "Thank you for reminding us what first class truly looks like." Evelyn folded the note and tucked it into the same weathered notebook that held children's drawings and letters from grateful families. It belonged there more than anywhere else. As the aircraft crossed above endless clouds glowing beneath the afternoon sun, conversation slowly returned to the cabin, but it was softer now. Strangers introduced themselves to one another. Phones remained tucked away. People who had spent years measuring others by appearance, status, and possessions found themselves asking different questions and listening more carefully to the answers. Daniel and Evelyn spoke quietly for the rest of the journey, sharing memories of those who never came home and celebrating those who had. They laughed at small moments no history book would ever record, honoring ordinary acts of kindness that had carried people through extraordinary darkness. Before landing, Daniel stood one final time. Without ceremony, without speeches prepared in advance, he offered Evelyn the crispest salute he had given in years. She did not return it as a soldier would. Instead, she placed one hand over her heart and nodded with the same quiet humility that had guided her through every emergency room, every sleepless night, and every life she had touched without expecting recognition. In that simple exchange, every passenger understood that real honor was never something worn on a uniform or printed on a boarding pass. It was something carried in the choices made when no one was watching. Because the world rarely remembers every act of kindness, but kindness remembers the world forever. As the plane descended toward the runway and strangers prepared to continue their separate lives, each carried away a story impossible to leave behind, and perhaps, the next time they noticed someone who seemed ordinary, they would pause before deciding who belonged where. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who could use a reminder that the quietest people often carry the greatest courage, because every stranger you meet may be living proof that compassion can change far more lives than anyone will ever know.